Hi there, and welcome to another episode of From Ireland to Palestine. We're very fortunate today to have two brilliant Palestinian guests who are over visiting Ireland. Firstly, we have Saleh Hijazi, who's a former researcher and regional director at Amnesty International and now policy coordinator for the BDS movement, and Shahd Hammouri, who is a lecturer in legal theory and international law at the University of Kent. And he's also an international lawyer who's contributed to cases at the world's highest courts, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having
Thank you.
us.
So, I thought I'd start with a BDS question. So, for you, although many of these obviously have a legal side, so you could both chip in on them. But you've described BDS as a legal obligation. Why is that?
Well, this is something that the International Court of Justice has come to confirm. The BDS movement was launched in 2005 following a call from the largest coalition in Palestinian civil society, from trade unions, federations, syndicates, grassroots organizations calling to boycott Israel, divest from Israel, and impose sanctions against Israel until Palestinians are able to enjoy their inalienable rights of self-determination and return. The call in 2005 came a year after the International Court of Justice issued its first ruling on the situation of Israel policies against Palestinians. And was particularly about the building of the apartheid wall and the expansion of the criminal settlement enterprise. And what came in that advisor opinion was that, what Israel is doing is illegal in terms of the wall and the settlements, but also that states have an obligation not to recognize this illegal situation and not to render aid and assistance to it. What that translates to is that states have an obligation not to be complicit in Israel's violations of international law. So that's part of the story of BDS, right? But it's a fundamental one where the movement and the call to boycott, divest, and sanction is grounded in international law according to the ICJ. Now, 20 years since, the ICJ has come again to rule, one, in the case that was brought by South Africa against Israel for committing genocide in Gaza. And two, again, to rule on Israel's presence, that's the military occupation and the illegal settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. And in both rulings, the ICJ has again confirmed that states and institutions and corporations have an obligation not to recognize an illegal situation, such as, for example, Israel's illegal presence in apartheid, but also not to render aid and assistance to it. So again, the ICJ has come to confirm that there's an obligation not to be complicit. Now, following that ICJ advisory opinion of July 2024, you had some very prominent legal experts, human rights activists, including one that we always like to highlight, Craig Mukhaybar, who is a senior director of the Human Rights Department at the UN in New York, who resigned from his post in November in protest against the inaction of the UN and states with regards to Israel's genocide.
2023, was it right?
Yes, exactly. And he he penned an article after the ICJ advisory opinion to say that the ICJ has now made it clear BDS is not only a right, it is also an obligation. So this is the story, basically, part of the story of the BDS, but that the movement is essentially grounded in international law, and this is confirmed by the highest court in the world.
And Shahad, does that mean there's also a legal obligation on citizens if states aren't following through on their obligations?
So the whole point of international law is to stop armed conflict and to create international peace and security. The idea is that when someone is committing a violent act, you either respond through violence or you respond through peaceful means. Economic ways of making their venture unprofitable always seemed like a very logical way to stop an illegality. Without committing any direct violence against someone, you simply make it and render it unprofitable. And in reality, we live in a very interdependent world. We live in a very globalized world economy with very complex value chains. Everything that Israel is doing is very much interwoven into the global economy. So that gives states, corporations, and normal citizens' power and capacity and privilege in order to stop and render this illegality not just simply unprofitable, but unworkable. This strategy or this tactic was really clear in cases of ending colonization, in the case of South Africa, as well as other states other decolonization movements that actually asked for this tactic to be used. So as noted by Saleh, by now it is it's actually in customary international law, the rule that the International Court of Justice has declared, and this should have been clear since 1967. Let's be very clear. So states didn't really need the court to come and say and tell them that. It was built into stone. It's, if you want to end this, then make it unprofitable. It wasn't really a very difficult thing to reach. But of course, with all of the political distortion, it took us almost like when we were watching the decision in last year in July 2024, I was sitting next to my mother, who was born in 1967. So it took my mother's lifetime for an international court to declare what should have been the most basic thing, and actually was declared at the United Nations very early on. Since the 1970s and 80s, the United Nations General Assembly did call for the boycott of Israel and for states, and it clearly stated that when states collaborate with Israel on technology, on weapons, they are infringing on the premises of international peace and security. But sadly, that was a forgotten history. As per individual responsibility, so sadly enough, what has happened is the evolution of international law has been skewed, let's say, into the benefit of both the colonizers and corporations profiting of war. So these laws were never really genuinely translated either on the international fora or on the national fora. However, when we want to look at basic principles of responsibility, as per, for example, how authors like Iris Marion Young would argue, every person that has privilege and capacity in order to confront people who are stuck in a situation that it can be called ethical loneliness, which is basically where you are stuck in a situation of helplessness, whereby the only way that your situation can be solved is through genuine solidarity from others. Otherwise, the world doesn't even recognize or hear your story, as you can see with the genocide in Gaza. Even when it comes to starvation, and we have it in picture and everything, and you have US and British officials coming and saying, oh no, you're just imagining this. So in this case, the only way to come out of that paradoxical situation is through others partaking in the effort and using their own privilege and capacity. So in the sense of very basic theory of personal responsibility towards this, but also on a legal level, I'm sorry I took too long.
No,
on a legal level, what happens is that technically speaking, as a consumer who is buying a product that feeds into an illegal situation, you yourself also become on some level complicit or responsible in that value chain because you used your purchase power in order to contribute to the value chain. And the logic here, when we talk about the responsibility of businesses, is that it stretches all the way down from the producer all the way to the consumer, everyone who participated in it. And that's the only way we can imagine personal responsibility. It requires a little bit of a stretch of imagination, true. And let's say everything in capitalism has worked towards limiting that stretch of imagination. But in reality, that's the only way that we could move forward as a humanity, really, if we are to ever have an equitable economy that serves equality for everyone. So when we talk about BDS, we're actually also talking about a stretch of imagination that helps us imagine more generally how is it that we act as actors and consumers inside of a larger global economy.
Yeah. In a sense, we're told all the time in capitalism that the main way you act to affect things is your purchasing power. So in a sense, we can use that against it by telling people, look, always think about what you're buying, and you can affect things a little bit in that way. I suppose it's unlikely that people will be held individually legally responsible as consumers, but still you are legally breaching international law, and certainly on a moral level, you're breaching something when you buy something that's complicit with Israel. I also want to ask about the BDS principle of gradualism. Obviously, BDS is like a long-term project to sort of wear down the Zionist state. But how does that mechanism apply amidst the urgency of genocide? Like if you need things to change very, very fast because the things are so bad, how does gradualism apply in that context?
Um, well, look, we're against a massive enemy, right? Of we're just discussing part of kind of the context of then racial capitalism
Yeah.
that is driven by empire, with Israel as a settler colony, that has been imposing apartheid on Palestinians for over 78 years, and has now come to the point of genocide, where it's very hard to imagine how we're able to win by knockout
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, that's true.
But we can always strategize about how we win by points. And what is at the center target of the BDS movement is ending complicity. Like, so Israel is not able to carry out, to entrench apartheid for over 78 years and now reach a point of genocide if it is not for the complicity of states, institutions, and corporations. Um, I- if Israel is not receiving weapons from the US, Germany, the UK, France, Italy, and so on, of the Western powers, if Israel is not able to get these weapons because of the action of other states around the world, including in the global south, by preventing, for example, the transfer of these weapons, if Israel is not receiving the investment of the big finance companies and the banks, if it is not able to market its weapons and surveillance technology and so on and so forth, it would not be able to do what it is doing right now to the Palestinians in Gaza, us in the West Bank, and the Palestinians across the 48 and so on. And so the strategy here is to end this complicity at kind of these various levels. So the B is about individuals being able to take actions, including groups. So individuals and groups being able to look where they are and to see what links they have, whether it is the consumer links, the institutional links, the action links, if they are, for example, let's say, cultural organizations, and to cut these complicity ties. And then the D is about then the divestment from the companies, including here, and this goes back to kind of the capitalism, those shareholders in companies that are investing in Israel or are operating in Israel, have any kind of relationship with the Israeli economy, to even from within kind of protest and cause both reputational and economic harm to the companies because of their complicity, reaching then to the policy level of states and imposing sanctions on Israel. So we'll have to work that gradually. Now, nothing is meeting, and we have to be honest about that. Not to nothing is meeting what is required to stop a genocide. It's been almost 2 years now. It's relentless. It's increasing, and Israel is not is not only able to continue with it as it is. It is developing the tactics of the genocide. So where we are right now seeing, the weaponization of humanitarian aid, the use of starvation of a weapon. This was not at the beginning of the genocide, which was mostly about, massive bombing and the destruction of people, of universities, of hospitals, and so on. Nothing is meeting that, right? But we have to continue with then the strategies of building. You cannot say because I have no magic trick to stop it, or I don't have this one action that would stop it, because there's none, right? That we can think of. That then the strategy of kind of building incrementally and continuing to push outside to kind of cut these complicity links, that is not working. That's actually working. There is around the globe actions taken primarily by people, because BDS is premised on people power. It is the theory that it is only through people action, people mobilizing, people organizing, that you're able to create the change that you want. Now, that also takes a long time. And for it to be strategic and impactful as well. But you see things happening, whether it is companies leaving Israel, whether it is cultural and academic institutions cutting links, universities divesting, even states now. And this is something that we would not have ever imagined happening perhaps 2-3 years ago before the genocide, instituting policies and taking measures to hold Israel accountable. Malaysia, for example, closed down its ports to Israeli ships and ships destined to Israel as early as October 2023. Turkey has cut all trade relations with Israel. Colombia has announced that it will suspend coal. South Africa has taken Israel to the International Court of Justice. Now, there are all shortcomings to these decisions and the policies and so on. The movement continues to push for these sanctions, but we have to continue on building incrementally. Yep.
And you mentioned there the concept of a knockout blow and the fact that Israel is increasing and devising new ways to carry out its genocide. Do you think its intention is to, as Donald Trump's been saying, to finish the job before things like BDS and other actions can take effect against Israel? Do you think that's their strategy, knowing that long term they're probably doomed, so they can just finish it off and make the Palestinian question, as they refer to it, as a thing of the past? I think that's their strategy.
Well, 1 week ago when we were in Colombia, I was actually saying that it. So we've been trying to work really hard in not just one tactic, multiple parallel tactics, really, in that try to come together with the mobilization and also with situating Palestine as a part of a much larger struggle. But in reality, what has become really clear is to get one loaf of bread into Gaza, you need to change the whole world order.
Yeah.
And if that's the price that is being put forward, then that means that the whole world has the responsibility of the blood that has been spilled in Gaza to take that forward. And we all know that, and what the case of Palestine has really shown us, cases of extremity shed power relations bare. And this case of extremity has shown us the tensions in Ireland, the unresolved tensions, in the previously colonized world, the unresolved tensions. It has shown us how the US imperialism has weaved its way to take the will of the people away from them and their voices away from them. It manifests itself in so many different ways. So in reality, the only way to understand the plan going forward for the US is to see where the US itself is going. Whether the US will admit it or not, its empire is indeed collapsing on itself. And the fascist rise that we see now can only be destined to live very shortly, because fascism cannot live very long. Anyway, it's because the soft power that the US was using for decades now was actually allowing it to uphold some sort of an image of legitimacy around the world. But now that is gone completely. So the masses are going to realize that. So we think that. Yes, if they move forward. So for us, it's an unimaginable future at a whatsoever level. And not only that, like it's not something that we would ever be willing to negotiate or accept or until, even if there's one Palestinian still left, we will still never allow that to happen. They can call it whatever they want. They can call it annexation. They can try to take it out. They can, but we will never accept that. And we do that with a very, very clear image in our mind, which is, one, this empire is failing, but two, no colonization ever lasts. Whether it's this generation, the next generation, or the generation after, at some point in Arabic we say "La budda lil layli an yanjali." The night has to end. So yes, we see them. They might come. They might take it. They might complete the genocide. They might actually push all the people out of Gaza. This might even get worse. Every time in the past 2 years, I think the amount of times that I called people and they were telling me, "Oh, this must be the worst thing that we will see," and it then just gets worse and worse. And yet I still do have some comrades that I would call, and they would tell me that, Shahd, it's always the darkest chapter before the dawn. So, but we don't know when is the darkest gonna come. But yeah, my point is that I think once we understand Palestine as being at the forefront of a much bigger global movement, the left after 1991 has managed to seep itself into more or less of a destructive mode, and a lot of people were raised up in a world where we can't even imagine that there would be a global movement that responds to imperialism. And here is Gaza to remind us that such a movement is possible, not just for the sake of Palestine, but for the sake of the global majority, really. So with that dream, with that idea, with that hope, in reality, what Gaza is doing is rebuilding something that is way much more aspirational and bright than the darkness that Trump wishes to and Netanyahu wish to bestow on it. But yeah, we don't think that it's like, even if it happens, that's just one chapter of the story.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly on this. I mean, in terms of like kind of understanding our Jewish allies in the United States, Jewish Voice for Peace, has come to say that Israel is carrying out the final solution in Gaza now. And indeed, I mean, what you see is this massively aggressive genocidal push of using, and we just talked about kind of like the escalation of the tactics. But this has been going on since 1948. I mean, the intention of the Zionist project is the elimination of the indigenous people from their homeland. David Ben-Gurion, when he walked through the Palestinian villages west of Jerusalem, Deir Yassin and others that were completely depopulated by the Zionist militias at the time, he said that what I see here is what I want to see across the country. Meaning, no Palestinians, an area that is empty where we can then build this project of ours. Before the genocide in Gaza started in October 2023, Bezalel Smotrich was a self-proclaimed fascist, homophobe minister of finance and a minister in as well the Ministry of the Army in Israel, had called out for the wiping out of Hawara, which is a village south of Nablus. And at the time, the Raphael Lemkin Institute for the Prevention of Genocide has issued a warning. And that was in April 2023, that what is happening in the occupied West Bank is a risk of genocide because of these statements and, of course, the kind of the policies and the actions. So there's always been the intent right from the beginning. I always tell the story as well, like, and today there's a picture of Bezalel Smotrich along with some other settler leaders in an area south of Jenin, where the settlers have been trying to retake. It was a settlement that was removed in 2005, and now they want to repopulate it again. And he has a picture next to a graffiti that says in Hebrew, Mavid al-Arabim, which is death to Arabs. And this is a very popular slogan among Israeli society that you hear in the media, in football stadiums, on the streets. My grandmother's house in Jerusalem, when I enter, there is also that sprayed in the staircase going up to her apartment. So just to kind of say that yes, we're living a very dark, very violent, very brutal chapter of this, but it has been going on for 78 years, and Palestinians have been able to be resilient and resist. And as Shahd is saying, yes, it's a very dark chapter, but it is not a chapter that you'll see an end of the story of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I suppose that is the hope, that if Palestinians have been resilient for this long, they can get through just about anything, and we need that at this point. And Israel does clearly feel threatened still by some of the actions being taken. It does feel threatened by BDS. It says BDS is the main danger to it, and they're threatened by the legal action that's being taken. So they're known for intimidating in a sort of mafia style prosecutors within the ICC. But I just wonder, have you two encountered any kind of direct harassment or threats from Israeli officials, army people, anything like for the BDS movement or for your work in international law?
Well, just to say one thing is that if you a powerful state doesn't act so fearfully and doesn't act so violently, and this violence, this thirst for blood is really simply a reaction to its mass realization of an existential problem, of the unsustainability of the situation that has been created in the settler colony, of the death of that dream. And this response is more or less that of a monster that is trying to take out as much as possible before it dies. And it's a very persistent historical type of story. And it's hilarious, the world that we live in, where, for example, the UK sanctions a few settlers, or some European states sanction a few settlers. Meanwhile, Palestinians, not only are they born sanctioned, like, as a Palestinian, you can't travel anywhere. It's almost impossible to get visas. But add to that the further sanctioning that you receive. So for me, as of 3 weeks ago, there was a list by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs against people who worked with the International Criminal Court and people who have engaged in lawfare against Israel, because God forbid that we we're not allowed to resist using arms. We're not allowed to say no with the boycott. We're not allowed to say no with the law. We're just you should just die like silently without being heard. So I've never been inside. So I've never been to the West Bank. I've never been to Palestine because I was born outside of it, and like almost, I think it's 8 million or so who have the same situation, who have never even been allowed to cross the border inside. So now being on that list means that I will only see it free. And add to that, there is the sanctioning in the US for anyone who's worked with the International Criminal Court. So that also includes it. But again, that is nothing in comparison to the prosecution that others have seen. In the UK, there's been very high targeting of academics who are working on Palestine. Not only does it mean that you get that, there's a... When I first started in academia, there was a conference, the European Conference of International Law, the European Society of International Law's annual meeting, and there was a discussion on Palestine. I remember one professor came to me and he's like, "Shahd, wait before you kind of burn your cards in this society." And I burned it very quickly, very fast. And that means that as an international lawyer, you will not be taken seriously in a lot of places. First, it was because you're emotional, as of course, as an emotional Arab angry woman.
Sexist as well, right?
Yeah, as with any racialized peoples. But secondly, that means that really when it comes to your opportunities in terms of funding, in terms of actually being considered an expert of the same level, you've killed that opportunity. But I've also dealt with students who are some students are in jail for their activism. Some students are incapable of finishing their degrees, and a lot of people for the most simple of things. And indeed, now in the UK, the prosecution is at the weirdest, most awkward, illegally nonsensical position with the prescription of Palestine Action, where so that means that everyone who's on the fringes of whatever is under the threat of at least harassment by the police, which is insane to say the least, especially when it comes to anti-war activists who are saying, "Please stop the war." So we live in a almost hilarious theater of cruelty, so to speak, from the prosecution, left, right, and center. But I think when my name first appeared on that list and I told my friends, their reaction was also equally hilarious, because everyone was congratulating me because it's such an honor. And a recognition of my work. So in our culture, it's become the other way around. We congratulate people whenever they pay prices. And indeed, of course, this is not a price at a whatsoever level in comparison to the prices being paid by, the larger majority of the Palestinian population.
Of course, yeah. Saleh?
I mean, to say is that we're part, Shahd was pointing to a part of this, of a community of human rights defenders, activists, Palestinians, whether inside of Palestine or outside of it, that is systematically targeted by Israel and its allies, right? So in the UK as well, the repression in Germany, in the US, that you're always in a way kind of waiting for your turn. And when something like this happens, you kind of, at the beginning, you deal with it in that kind of like humorous sense of congratulation. You've made it onto this list or that list, because there are many of them as well, right? But it can get very serious. We have to acknowledge that our friends and colleagues in Gaza have been killed, their families have been killed, their homes have been destroyed, their places of work, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Al Mizan, and so on, of the other organizations. In the West Bank, we have colleagues who are banned from traveling outside, others that are in administrative detention or in prison. Those are constantly harassed, others that are prevented from coming back home to Palestine, for example, and so on and so forth. So organizations that are being criminalized, like Al-Haq and Al-Damir and others, and allies like including UN independent experts like Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, who has now sanctions imposed on her by the United States, which also has implications on the wider community of those who work with Francesca Albanese, who talk to her, communicate with her, and so on and so forth. So you're in that, while what perhaps me, not speak for Shahd, but for at least for me, what I'm facing is nothing compared to that. You start thinking of colleagues in Gaza and all the way through kind of that list of criminalization and attacks and so on. But you're still in a place where you're targeted by the most powerful in kind of various ways, from the violence leading to the killing and injuries and so on, to the detention, to the harassment, to the restrictions, to the repression, judicial harassment, and so on and so forth in Palestine, colonized Palestine, but also outside of it.
Well, yeah.
I just wanted to add also, they make the price tag very high. That's the thing. Like, if you want to, and there, of course, the price tag is higher the more precarious you are. So, for example, if you're in Gaza, the price tag is directly death or prison. In the West Bank, very similar price tag. But then it becomes at any level, even when you're abroad, not just by Israel, but also by ally government like the British and whatnot. At all points, you feel that what I'm doing could risk not only myself, but my family relations. It becomes for so many people, we work with, it's on such an intricate level of not seeing your mother for the next 10 years, or things like that. And then it always becomes, you can see how it eats up on people, in people's souls, all of that deprivation. Like, for example, some colleagues who are in Jerusalem are always under the threat of being evicted. And I've had some colleagues who are like, you know what, like, do anything to me, but don't deny me ever again seeing Jerusalem. But yet they know that that is the price that like Israel and allies put in front of them, for also like doing what would otherwise be seen like in the rest of, like, for human rights lawyers. Like, it is absolutely insane that these people would end up having, to be deprived so much for such basic things. But then again, that just tells you the horrendousness of the monster of which we speak.
Yeah. It's kind of like any that thing where you're wrecking people's family lives is kind of an extension of what's always been, was the case here in Ireland, and has been the case in Palestine, of, if someone's an activist in any way, they would also target their family, like destroy their family home or torture their family or whatever. It's kind of just a continuation of that practice in a different form, isn't it? I want to kind of move on to like the foundations of international law. I think, Shahd, you've been quite critical of international law and said it's always sort of had a fundamentally Eurocentric character and hasn't really ever been a tool for people of the global south. Do you want to maybe go into that a bit?
So the idea that there should be a law that that really governs relationships on a mass collective level, like us as humans, we started off as small communities, suddenly we're really big communities, and that idea has really existed quite for a long time. Contemporary international law, as we know it, is just one iteration of it, and that iteration really evolved during colonization. You're talking about Vittoria, Grotius, even the godfather of international humanitarian law, who is Henry Dunant. He was a colonizer who actually saw one of the battles during World War I, was it? and on his way to seek the patronage of Napoleon to gain access of water for his land in Algeria. So that he could develop his investments, because of course Algerians were not human, and even international humanitarian law, when it evolved for the longest time ever, colonizing states, including of course England, argued that colonized people are either citizens of their own country, so international law doesn't apply, or that they're not human, so like why consider them civilians? But to make that law legitimate, they had to create some sort of a phantom of justice. They had to say that, oh, actually, you need to follow this because we're more civilized than you and we know what's better. And during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when there was decolonization movement, a lot of the people who were at the forefront were like, okay, so you tell us that you want to build this international legal order on the premises of justice. We will build that. We will accept something. So these things, of course, are fatal mistakes, which are like accepting statehood, like accepting the borders, accepting a very European way of understanding how international relations ought to happen. A lot of people spoke against it, but then it happened. And acquired rights, for example, rights that were there during colonization. And European states were like, okay, we'll give you your independence, but BP gets to exploit the hell out of that oil field in Nigeria. And if you say no, we will invade you. And of course, for example, they did that with the Suez Canal crisis in Egypt. So the law itself evolved in that way. However, there was a moment in that decolonization movement where the newly decolonized people, some representatives went to the UN and they were like, you know what? Now that we're considered to be equals, let's actually play the game. And they developed something called the Declaration on Friendly Relations that sought to translate the UN Charter in a different way. What they were trying to say is, oh, you say this UN Charter is premised on international peace and security. International peace and security only happens if we end domination, subjugation, and exploitation. And it was a very different reading of international law. And you could see that in the International Court of Justice. Judges like Amoun, Alvarez, and Bejawi, they were coming in and saying, actually, no, this is the time for a new international order built on understanding interdependence. It's built on negating corporate power. So, for example, Salvador Allende, he stood in front of the United Nations in 1972 and said, oh, corporate power is ruining my country. And we should challenge it. And actually, after that, they started building a code for transnational corporations. So there is some way whereby there was a project to rebuild that law and harness it for the purpose of emancipation. And with South Africa, we see that very clearly. And South Africans came in a time where the geopolitical order in the Cold War allowed some space of breathing for states of the Global South to create that ethos of new international law. So at the 1960s, we had the Declaration of Independence, of ending colonization. 1970s, we had the Declaration of a new international economic order. But these, again, were buried. So if you're an international law student in your first year of your LLM, you would never hear of these documents. And you would never hear of this reading of international law, nor would you hear of the colonial history of international law and how to counteract that. That maybe in some universities would come as a class towards the end, which is what we call third world perspectives on international law. So, however, the case of Palestine has become the most classic case of a question that we pose to students of how can international law be used as a tool of domination and emancipation. And ever since 1967, Palestinians have sought to leverage this tool. So when you're in a battle of liberation, really, you need to use all the available tactics. You need to do economic boycott. You need to do legal strategies. You need to do resistance on the ground. You need to do all of these because it's so big. And so that tactic, and that's why I call people like myself on the international legal liberation front, that tactic has been steadily taken forward, for example, with the 2004 decision on the wall case that Saleh has mentioned, in the most recent case. Those build up on an insane amount of work that people have spent their whole life building on. But with that comes Palestine being at the forefront of the global global South reading of international law as well. What Palestinians are building on is not that colonial ethos, but they're actually pinpointing the contradictions at the heart of the story, saying, you guys are talking about justice and peace and security, and then you're telling me that peace and security is by upholding an imperial power like the US. So really, by digging up those contradictions in the South Africa case, for example, and whatnot, empire feels uncomfortable. But it's not, so it's a crack in the system rather than saying that really the system works in our benefit. I always go back to a quote by a dear colleague named Abdul Ghani Sayed in a panel. He was saying it's not about actually what international law is doing to Palestine. The question is what Palestine is doing to international law, and how it's at the forefront of a new of reviving that project, that trading, but also at the same time destroying that. Really, I could say very clearly, international criminal law was killed in this process. Like it has become just a spectacle of comedy. Like, what the hell is this? Like the International Criminal Court is begging the world to do what it is supposed to do. Even the prosecutor, Karim Khan, when he was standing in East Jerusalem, he called it Israel. Like, that's the type of person that we're talking about. Like, he is so ignorant of the context that he actually mislabeled even the colonial borders that were drawn and whatever little was left for the Palestinians. And even with that, he was prosecuted by the US for whatever he was doing. So that discipline really has been completely mocked by empire, and Palestine has led to a complete existential crisis in that discipline, international criminal law specifically. And that really does stretch out to the larger, so a few months ago, UN rapporteurs issued a statement saying that international law is at a knife's edge. And it is true, because Palestine has shown this absolute contradiction in the whole system. And not only that, even physically, the UN is now being absolutely defunded by the rise of Trump. And we can't deny that the whole political spectrum of what happened in Palestine did facilitate the rise of Trump in one way or the other. And did play a role in it. For better or worse, it's actually facilitating the death of that system. But then, is it not the moment to move the UN outside of the US? Is it not the moment to have another premises of international law? Is it not the moment that we actually own this project rather than let that project control us? And there is a lot of that. And for some reason now, Palestinian international lawyers are actually being put at the forefront of the whole of the discourse of international law. And that's quite a spectacular change that I think, even though we don't realize its magnitude now, 20 years, 30 years from now, we realize its magnitude.
Do you want to add anything to that, Salah?
To that. I mean, maybe a couple of things is just to say that, it is, we have to recognize and work according to that. This is a space of contestation. You have to recognize the colonial infrastructure, if you want, of the system that we have right now, all the heritage that it was built and put in place for the domination of colonial power of basically all others around the world. Yet, there has been, Shahd was pointing to some, I can point to others, including, when you look at the Genocide Convention, which is right now kind of at the heart of what's happening in Gaza, and a place where, there is a very significant contestation with South Africa bringing a case against Israel. The Genocide Convention was put together by the oppressed, right? Raphael Lemkin, who was the legal scholar, the Jewish legal scholar who was behind it, had the people, his people, in Europe when, he was lobbying and advocating for this crime to be codified in international law. And indeed it was. Apartheid as well, a convention, a crime against humanity. This came from then the struggle against apartheid in Southern Africa, South Africa, Namibia, and Rhodesia at the time, Zimbabwe, and so on. And so you could see that while we don't see the implementation of international law now as it should be, with all its problems, yet you could make colonized people around the world, the oppressed people around the world, use this as a place of contestation and can gain, can have gains that then you build on towards the decolonization of international law, of the UN itself. Moving it outside of the US is part of that decolonization, perhaps. The whole kind of structure of funding of the UN can also be addressed. But what we have now, it kind of come very clear, and I think Shahd was pointing to that as kind of Palestine is the litmus test for this system, multilateral system based on the rule of international law. And at the heart of this is that until now, international law has not been able to address colonialism and settler colonialism in particular. And being able to address that in a way similar to how genocide and apartheid were addressed in international law. And I think Palestine is bringing this to the forefront. So Palestine will not be liberated through the courts. It will not be liberated through international law. But still, this is one of the spaces, venues, if you want, where we have to continue to basically contest, push, challenge, and change towards the decolonization then of it, and eventually, then the decolonization of Palestine elsewhere around the world.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but just strategically for listeners, international law is also very useful in evading the traps of the law, because now we have international court saying it's an illegal occupation, it's genocide, it's plausible genocide. I hate the word plausible, but these are very strategic on the street.
Because I heard you say that before, so I didn't drop it. To me, is there an issue with the term plausible genocide? Because to me, like even it's more like the inaction on it rather than the term. To me, like even if somebody said there's a 1% chance of genocide, to me that should trigger tremendous action. So the problem isn't necessarily with the term, but just with the inaction.
Well, it's like, how frustrating it is to talk to a lawyer. It's
I do,
yeah. It's exactly that. It is like, and it's actually become very weird when you meet international lawyers of who's saying the word genocide and who's saying plausible genocide. And I feel ashamed when I have to say it, when I'm being asked to be quote unquote professional in that sense.
I see what you mean in that sense, yeah.
Yeah, but in reality is, again, the fact that we need a court that actually, the International Criminal Court of Justice, accepted Israel's request to prolong the hearings on it. I'm like, who prolongs a hearing on a genocide? Like, it's like, oh, you're being mass murdered. Wait in line, please.
Yeah.
It's for us to have to wait for a proclamation by a court for 2 years to call what we could see in our own eyes. I just woke up this morning to an image of a man who has been starved, and then there's blood running all across his body. So imagine a starved body that has blood on it, and you tell me that is not as a part of over 100 years of struggle of people in a settler colonial context. I don't need a court to tell me that this is a genocide. There's even worse. For example, I've worked with I've commented on the work of the Commission of Inquiry in the on Palestine at the UN, and I have such big problems with the way they operate. But at some point, she said that there is a plausible risk of conditions that could amount to, the what's it called, ending the group, like literally the legal, but not saying it. So what kills me really is that, with the ambiguity, if I create 1% ambiguity for you as a lawyer, I have a lot of space to play. And that is what they're doing. They're infesting ambiguity. And a lot of people have actually discussed this in critical scholarship of international law, whereby you infest indeterminacy into the word. So, for example, after the first case, the South Africa case, there was the first order by the court. So under international law, the moment you say plausible genocide, the moment you say that there is a possibility that a genocide might be committed, all states around the world have a duty to prevent genocide.
Yeah.
And ironically, the International Court of Justice ended up putting itself in such a problem by making this right such a big right in a prior case, in the Bosnia case, where there was also a lot of politicization. But the moment you say the word, actually it's supposed to trigger, there isn't supposed to be a debate about it.
Yeah.
But yet, the prior head of the International Court of Justice then went on live and was like, no, actually, there was that Israel needs to stop in case it invades Rafah, and there was a comma there somewhere. And she was like, no, the comma says if they enter Rafah, not like literally she was discussing the comma and the conditionality of whether or not there should be a ceasefire. And that is someone who was entrusted with being the president of the International Court of Justice. And that is, with all due respect, very dirty play. Like, you know, like, and that's what really kills you about the court of law. That really what kills you about people wearing suits in The Hague, which has nothing to do with anything in the world, being completely desensitized to the level of violence of which they speak, and are playing around with words. Absolutely, I've met people who are completely fine with saying that, and no, don't say it. So it's yes, it's icky. It's a genocide. Calling it, when whoever you hear calling it plausible, know that they also are mentally desensitized. They're cognitively disconnected from reality. And not only that, not only are they disconnected from the current reality, they're disconnected from the reality of the whole history of colonization, because it only takes someone who hasn't looked at the history of colonization in the eye to question for a second what is happening here. And of course, the International Court of Justice hasn't reckoned with the history of colonization, nor has the whole international legal community. They live in completely Control-Alt-Delete colonial erasure and of everything that has happened prior to the Second World War. And Francesca Albanese really captures this really well in her, I think, third report, I think, on genocide, where she talks very well on colonial erasure and that being a continuation of it.
I mean, I completely agree that, like, if anybody, one civil society, anyone just debating it now refers to plausible genocide rather than actual genocide, that's incredibly obnoxious, because it's been so blatant from a week after October the 7th, 2023. I just mean that it's the enforcement mechanism seems to be the issue. And just a follow on question from that. I mean, there's a quote from, it's attributed to Noam Chomsky. I'm not sure it's actually him or not, but he says that politics is a shadow cast by business over society, which means that, you know, politics is just basically controlled by rich people. Is law not in effect the same thing? It's another shadow cast by business or the powerful over the world. And so the trick for law is it's law, international law, and its failure is a symptom of larger problems. And the priority is to fix those problems, the imbalances in power, the hegemons that control things. That's the real issue, and law is all just a symptom of that higher up failure.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
international lawyers who don't think that their practice is political are also very oblivious to like what we're doing is here pure politics, and at the heart of it is pure politics and the way it was shaped. Like, for example, with the Nuremberg trials right after the Second World War, there was something called the industrialist trials, which were against the businessmen who were a part of the Nazi
Yeah.
regime. And what the US clearly very fast realized the danger of that. There is a great article by Gretche Bars on this, and they pulled the plug when they realized that they might be creating a precedent that might one day implicate their own businessmen. But then at the end of the day, when you read international law, a whole law that is supposed to be about stopping war doesn't talk why war happens. It doesn't really address the very big elephant in the room, which is really, in reality, what war inflates itself. War is an actual effect of imperialism and capitalism. The more you accumulate capital, the more you need to burn its excess, and at the heart of it is corporations and other war profiteers who are ensuring that this remains. The US keeps on entering failed wars, magnifying its military industrial complex, and ensuring that it burns any excess value that it has, and ensuring that it completes its dominance. The moment the US stops engaging in wars, actually, it will not be able to ascertain its dominance and keep it. It's very weird to enter rooms of international law where this is not even discussed, or this is not even, like, you know, it's as if it's an irrelevant consideration. And once I had an interview with Harris Gilkman, who worked in the United Nations for over 30 years on the topic of corporations and other economic topics. And he told me that, Shahd, the moment war erupts, the economists leave the room and the peace and security people come in because it's irrelevant. Anyway, sorry, it took too long. Do you want to comment on that?
I mean, I think no, you've done, but it is indeed kind of the larger structures of power of, you know, capitalism and imperialism. then this is, and of course, you'll see the powerful use and misuse, right? The law and so on. And again, like we go back that this is, the heritage and the foundations of this is, put in place for domination of, a group of people over another. And we're talking here on the global scale. Um, uh, to maintain, this dominance, right? Uh, so yes, I mean the answer to your question is yes, but also, and I continue kind of like go back to the point that I said that law remains kind of one of the spaces of contestation. So to go back on the kind of the plausible genocide, it is a genocide. Palestinians have been saying it right around the beginning. You had genocide, Holocaust, scholars that have then come to say it right after. Then you had the UN experts come and say it after that, and then and so on and so on. And kind of the case of genocide has been building all the way through to now. And with all the criticism we can talk about this of Israeli organizations now coming and saying, genocide is taking place in Gaza. But the thing about the International Court of Justice and the plausibility, and because of the Bosnia case, is because then what that means in terms of obligations by states and corporations of preventing genocide and not being complicit in genocide. So it becomes illegal. We don't want to get lost on that, right? It's what the court has said. The court may take another 5 years to determine, and we cannot wait for that.
No.
What we could use from the court's determination in January 2024 is that it, very clearly, without any question, has said that there are obligations on states and corporations to prevent and not to be complicit in genocide. And that is then what we, as kind of the movement, solidarity movement and so on, should be using when we're targeting the states we're in, the corporations that are domiciled in these states, and the institutions that have the links to Israel, the complicity and so on.
Yeah. So just a final question, because I know you're on a pretty tight schedule here, and it's about again state complicity and our own responsibility. Obviously, the main thing to look at in any dire situation is what we individually can do about it or collectively can do about it. So obviously, the question to ask in Ireland is what can we in Ireland do about it? What should the Irish state, what should corporations operating in Ireland do about it? So we learned recently, just a few days ago, that Israel has this enormous program to collect millions and millions of phone calls from Palestinians and store them in Microsoft's servers. And huge numbers, a huge amount of that data is apparently being stored in Ireland, and that adds to other layers of complicity that Ireland has. So maybe Saleh or either of you, what are the main responsibilities for both citizens and the government of Ireland in terms of ending complicity with Israel's genocide?
Yeah, so we go back to here kind of like BDS and escalating BDS, right? Because in terms of kind of like this infrastructure of complicity, you have the military companies, the armed production companies that are on top, of course, kind of with the governments facilitating and shielding Israel from accountability, supporting it politically, but then also allowing for the transfer of, and themselves transferring the arms to Israel by these companies that are manufacturing them. And then you have, this perhaps what we could call the second most complicit sector after the arms production company is the tech sector. And, you're seeing the militarization and the weaponization of technology, artificial intelligence, and so on. So, Gaza, we've been calling the genocide the first live stream genocide. It is also the first advertised genocide. You see Israeli military companies advertising kind of the use of technology, including, in the relationship with these companies like Microsoft, Palantir, Cisco, Google, and so on and so on. So you have these big companies that are directly complicit in the killing, the starvation, the domination, the control, the oppression, and so on. Then you have the finance sector, of course, that is kind of providing all of that, and then the energy, that is kind of like part and parcel also of the military kind of itself, because this is dual use. So you have here kind of an infrastructure, and here in Ireland you have a big part of it. So what do you do about it? And not only that this is a solidarity with the Palestinians. This is what do you do about it for yourselves, right? And what do you do about it as for then as well others around the world? Because and we've been discussing this yesterday, that Gaza is a front line for the whole of humanity. Right? So what is at stake is your humanity, mine, your life and mine, your ethics and mine, and so on. So and it goes back to kind of the question you were asking about, what to do on their mentality. Well, we have to recognize, or people here have to recognize, what this means to them, right? So you could see what it means to Palestinians in terms of genocide, the mass killing, the destruction, and so on. But what does this also mean to the people of Ireland? And what am I going to do about it? And to take it as the utmost priority to ensure that, as individuals, as communities, as organizations, as schools, as universities, as local councils, that we cut the relationships. We hold these companies accountable. We don't allow them to profit and to continue to develop, this kind of killing machine and being part of genocide, not only in Palestine, but elsewhere around the world. And that requires building of people power, of mobilizing and organizing, and kind of I like very much kind of like promote the campaign of the apartheid-free zones, for example, that the BDS movement has been pushing, because of kind of this kind of spatial conception, right, of imagining a space that is free of complicity. Right, you don't have links to apartheid, and you can expand that from, the studio we're in here to, for example, the building of this cultural center, to then the neighborhood in which you are, and then the city of Belfast, and then Northern Ireland, and then eventually, for example, Ireland. So how can we continue to kind of liberate and free spaces from where we are from these links of complicity, and therefore really holding the companies and not allowing Ireland to be the place where this is happening. So escalate BDS is the answer.
Very briefly, do you want to
Yes, I'll do my best to be very briefly. So I'll speak a bit like a lawyer. So as per the obligations of the State of Ireland, they're clear. The State of Ireland has the duty to use everything in its privilege and capacity to end the genocide, and has the duty to cooperate to end the illegal occupation of Palestine, and not to recognize anything that comes out of it. That means that the State of Ireland has the duty to stop all economic activity that could further allow Israel to entrench its occupation of Palestine. And that is a lot. And the Palestinian civil society has been arguing very strongly for what that really constitutes and how far that goes. And really, it really boils down to something very short. If we are to make this effective, this really has to cover a good deal of the complicit economic activities with the tech, with the finance, with the military industry and whatnot. Basically, sanctioning the Israeli economy, of course, in line with basic principles of human rights, in that respecting the human rights of Israeli citizens, and ensuring that the sanctions, they will still have the basic amenities. However, it still means making genocide and illegal occupation unprofitable, and that is not an activist position. That is basic international law, the State of Ireland has been shameful, to say the least. And of course, England has also been even more shameful. So as I said before, a few weeks ago, we were in Bogota for a conference, and actually Ireland did come to that conference. And in that, there was a discussion of how states can take forward their state obligations. And we were there to brief states about what their obligations are and what they need to do. Ireland didn't even come to that briefing, but also in the room before they arrived, Ireland said that they will be silent and they will not participate in the discussion. We were really scared that actually what they will do is that they would drive the discussion down, because states that come are like, oh, we are going to come and make commitments. Actually, these are your obligations. You're not coming to give anything extra. And the only reason that international law does put these rules in is because actually when a state does what Israel is doing, it's threatening the whole of international peace and security. So instead, what Ireland did is that it actually supported a meeting at the time in Europe, whereby they met with the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority came, and what they offered the Palestinian Authority is, okay, we will give you a recognition of statehood and give you back the money that Israel has been withholding, and in return you give up the call for sanctions. Which is not, you cannot derogate that. You cannot give up on it. But technically speaking, under the table, in short, this was what's happening. And that culminated now in New York, where European states, along with shameful Arab states, and I can't even start to describe the amount of shame that exists there, went and said that that declaration, the two-state solution, something that the Palestinians never agreed on, and no mention of reparations, accountability, you name it, basic things that under international law Ireland should uphold. Add to that, of course, the fact that ending those economic relations. So what people should do actually is, I would say, leverage these tools. The fact that this is actually what you signed up on. This is what the court should be contesting. This is what the MPs should know. And I really argue that people should be using this way much more, they're not giving anything extra. As for corporations, as of the ICJ decision in July 2024, these corporations have been given a notice. That notice says that this is an illegal occupation whereby there is systematic and structural forms of grave illegalities. That means that the corporation has to now, under the business and human rights guiding principles, it has to do what we call due diligence, to study whether or not how its activities can facilitate these grave illegalities. And the International Court of Justice has done the work for them. They told them, actually, this is all of the things that you could be complicit in: water, taxing, racialized laws, you name it. And you could be complicit in it. What corporations really need to do is to review their activities and to see whether or not they can. And if they cannot don't have any leverage to affect the situation for the better, they need to divest. Again, we go back to the fact that BDS is now a legal obligation, and again, this is not me or any radical thing. This is actually the really watered down business and human rights discourse that came after so much, and still it doesn't rise up to what we needed to do, and even after that. So corporations must be sent cease and desist letters to remind them of their obligations under that. And shareholders also need to remind corporations that they're not rising up to their ethical duties with that. And that could happen en masse. What we are now seeing is also support for strategic litigation against these corporations. And popular support would also be very useful, in the sense of people knowing what are the cases that are happening and holding prosecutors accountable, because prosecutors have been really, really reluctant to take things forward. Meanwhile, individuals can really do feeding into, aside from, of course, boycott, direct action, protesting, and all of the other tactics that you could do, even in creative forms of expression and whatnot. You could also add to that writing letters to MPs, councils. In the UK now, there's in England, there's now a campaign against councils and the investments of councils, tracing back the value chain of where it happens. But then now, I just want to point out that if people visit the website of Law for Palestine, there's a lot of guides and support what is the type of legal language that you could use. And we're going to be publishing a toolkit quite soon. But for example, we already have now a guide on what is state responsibility and corporate responsibility. So just simply summarizing that and using that in a letter really hits some red alerts inside of these mechanisms, because you're speaking their language and they have to respond to you if you're using that language rather than activist language. And really on this side, international law is really at our end. Now we're fully using it and with the people power. So sorry for taking too long, but
no, that's essential information. It's information we should all be taking on board. As actions we should all be taking straight away. So thanks very much, Saleh, Shahd.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
No problem.